So this is one of a series of webinars that we are proposing to have available. Today's session is all about the quality of education, thinking about some of the key aspects that we sort of would have had at the front of our minds before the emergency response to COVID-19 began to take place at the end of March, and really to give us an opportunity to kind of catch up with where we were before a whole raft of different things flooded our mind. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome to us our friends Clive Davies, who has worked with us on a number of different occasions and has provided a huge amount of really valuable support, and a gentleman that may be new to some of you, Devinder, Rait, who has a significant background in school leadership. He's also a currently serving inspector, but we'll explain, obviously, that he doesn't speak on behalf of Ofsted at the moment. But we very much hope he will be able to give us some insight into what he understands in terms of the new framework and the quality of education. So, to that extent, what we plan to do this afternoon is to give Devinder an opportunity to speak for 10 minutes or so to share some thoughts with you. And then we'll have a couple of minutes while we hand over to Clive, who will share some further thoughts with you. Both, I think, will have some slides that they will share and will be available to you afterwards as well. And then I have some pre-recorded or pre-prepared questions to share for our two speakers. If there are any key questions that you feel that you might want to ask during the course of the afternoon, please use the chat facility, type them in, and we'll see if we can squeeze them in, or we'll see if we can ask or consolidate questions so that people get as many of their questions answered during the course of the afternoon as is possible. So, really good to see you. Really glad that you could join us, and we very much hope that this is going to be of use to begin some thinking. So, without further ado, I think I would be very happy to hand over to Devinder, who is going to talk a little bit about the view from the inspection lens about where the quality of education judgment sits in our thinking, and perhaps more importantly, what we can be doing in this current period to be able to be sure that we pick up from a useful place as the next part of our journey unfolds. So, Devinder, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me, James. I think there were 5 questions that were asked of me. The first one relates to the update in terms of Ofsted thinking, and I refer to the Education Committee Accountability hearing with Devinder Spillman, HMCI, on the 29th of April. Firstly, there was no definite date when normal inspections will resume, or how any backlog is going to be addressed. The second point made was that there is a working theory which will include taking into account assuring parents that schools are looking after their children and educating them well, and secondly, recognise that education has been substantially disrupted and will continue to be so, do so. And thirdly, how it intends to support schools to think and plan for the circumstances that schools are facing themselves in. The next point regards the work that's already been done and the flexibility of the EFI framework, which lends itself quite well to the current climate that we face ourselves, or schools will need to be thinking about in the next few weeks. HMCI also says that Ofsted will not be judging schools per se on their response to COVID-19, and there is no specific expectation from the government. There are no standards for home learning or online learning on which to judge schools. Unlike the US, which has really an established online learning community and standards, which don't actually yield strong academic results. I don't know if there are lessons that we can learn from that, and I refer to the EDT report 2020. And most importantly, inspectors will look at how schools recognise the starting points and the level of achievement, which isn't where it might have been, and more importantly, what are schools doing to help pupils catch up swiftly. Ofsted will review or reconsider their risk assessment model in the light of COVID-19. Second point was regarding the schools that have good data and yet are going into RI or worse because of the quality of education judgment. What I'd like to say is, please note the comments that I make are my own. I don't represent or speak on behalf of Ofsted, nor do I have any authorization to do so. I speak from my experiences as a school improvement consultant and share with you what leaders have disclosed about their experiences over the last couple of months. In terms of the quality of education, leaders need to be more planned and prepared for that top level conversation, which is really important and complex and really helps to shape the inspection. Leaders must consider the evidence that they are going to be using, how it's been evaluated, validated, and quality assured. And thirdly, the opportunity, the top level conversation is not used well always and can lead to contradictions which give rise to inaccurate views of strengths and weaknesses. So it's not just about the historical published data. And I think lastly here, it's really important that school leaders have a clear understanding about what is systemic, what is typical, and what does the quality of curriculum actually mean. And I refer here to a definition from the International Bureau of Education, especially the SDG 4, Sustainability Development aspect number 4. So the key important point here is that don't do anything wrong for Ofsted. Do it because it's right for the pupils to have an impact-driven, enjoyable curriculum, which includes inclusiveness, equitable, characterized by quality learning, which is promoting lifelong learning and is relevant to holistic development. I think 3 points very quickly here. The context and the evidence base, the intent should be developed with a clear context, informed context and evidence-based research. And also where schools are using published schemes, they deliver these, but they don't always understand them well. In terms of implementation, it's about gathering the 6 evidence through the 6 methodologies and interconnecting this information to understand what pupils know more of, how they remember more, and what are they able to do as a result of that. And data doesn't feature here. And the key thing here is that the focus is on learning being an alteration in the long-term memory. If nothing is altered in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. Therefore, progress isn't achieved, which is knowing more, remembering more, and doing more. And because of a well-constructed, well-taught curriculum, it should lead to strong progress and the results that schools strive so hard to achieve. And one final thing here is that pupils will disclose and say what it is like. They'll talk about their learning, how they're supported, how much SATs preparation they face, and also what curriculum is missed as a result, which can give rise to issues around curriculum completeness. Designing a curriculum is really a complex process, and you do need a team that is well prepared and trained and is passionate. And hence this, I just wanted to share that screen for a moment just to illustrate that point about its complex nature. The third question was about what can you tell us that can happen at school level, subject leads and class teachers and that sort of thing. I think the key thing here is to shift attention to pupils' learning. All actions drive and underpin this. It's important to develop that clear vision, aims and values and processes that are understood and articulated by everybody at every level. It's about having real aspirational leadership at all levels, which thinks outside of the box. It's about unpicking the EFI criteria and developing impact-driven CPD, addressing workload and work-life balance, and does everyone understand the improvements that are being secured in the next steps? I've worked with schools with 19 questions in mind, which I'm not going to go through in detail, but I've used them with schools to look at the evidence, look at the strengths and weaknesses, rate, and create action plans, which leaders and schools have really found useful. Those 19 questions are listed here. Now, these will be available through James to everybody. On question number 4, on the basis of what I've seen so far, what do schools, teachers and governors need to know? I think there are a couple of things which I won't go through in detail, but teachers need to be very clear about why they're teaching this and why now, the degree to which their pupils' prior learning is taken into account for the new learning and where it intends to go next, and the effective use of formative assessment feedback, how they secure reading and the basic skills, and incorporate progress and learning, which means recall and memory, and long-term alteration in memory, how pupils can articulate and connect their prior learning fluently. And I think this will be even more important now, the creative deployment of adults and volunteers. And lastly, having a real professional discussion around curriculum planning and adaptation against the backdrop of COVID-19. In terms of governors, I think the key things there are that they've got to be familiar and clearly understand how they are monitoring, challenging and supporting the schools, how they've come to the evaluation of where the school is at. Using the IDSR and knowing the IDSR is really quite an important step forward. How they're using targeted funding and how that is spent and what the impact is, management of finances, and this is quite important. What is the spending accountability model which is being used? And the last few is around safeguarding and the culture and compliance that they are promoting, and their awareness of statutory duties. And the very last point there is regarding the well-being of staff and pupils in terms of their emotional, mental and physical post-COVID-19. I think those are really quite important points there. I think lastly, what could schools be doing now? I think they need to consider this crisis as an opportunity to collaborate, empower and find solutions together. What's going to make the most difference? How can we do things differently, unlearn and relearn for new approaches, making smarter use of digital technology, and think of it in terms of lifelong learning and all-year learning, restructuring and adapting the curriculum so that it addresses that love, desire, and engagement for learning, and also making use of the evidence-based research out there from the Education Endowment Fund, the Sutton Trust, and so on, and really promoting and harnessing that inherent learning capacity that children have. And thinking, and this is a really, really tough one, thinking about the components and composites and the sequence and the connectedness of the curriculum, which will take quite a lot of work. And as I'm not speaking on behalf of Ofsted, nor am I authorised to do so. This is purely from my work as a school improvement consultant and what I gathered. James, I hope that's okay.
Thank you very much, Devinder. Yeah, it's always really challenging, isn't it, to try and get as much information there as it is possible to do. And there were some really key messages that I'd like to assure everybody all of the information that Devinder has used will be able to pass on. I've just got a couple of quick questions before we hand on to Clive, if that's okay, Devinder.
Yes.
The first question would be just to recover or explain fully. There was a reference that you made to the top level conversation. Can you just explain where that comes in part of the new inspection framework process, and how that can be significant?
Okay.
Just anything else?
Very quickly, the top level conversation will be your first opportunity where you're going to be help set the context and the shape of the inspection. You're really sharing what the strengths of your curriculum are and the areas that you need to still focus on. And the evidence you're using to actually say what you're saying in terms of those strengths and areas. And I think schools haven't always thought about that clearly. And in some of the best schools and the practice that I've seen, leaders, the head teachers, bring their senior leadership teams, their subject leaders together, and they really thrash that conversation out, test each other, so that they're ready for that conversation that ultimately, will happen.
Thanks, Devinder. And what I'm hearing is the key to consistent communication and consistency around a vision for each of those three I's, which is really, really key. Absolutely. And I'm also hearing that there's a recognition of an impact of the current state of emergency response to COVID, and that Ofsted appear that there is an understanding that things are not going to be the same and there needs to be a period of adjustment. I suppose before we do finally hand on, I guess it would be really good to try and summarise that raft of information into, perhaps I'm putting you on the spot here, three key things that you think it would be really good for schools to be thinking of, or the three, the three most important messages that I think that we could take from the information that you've very kindly collaborated and sort of and put together for us.
Okay, three things. I think it's going to be around rethinking the curriculum and readapting that, harnessing and within that harnessing digital technologies even further. The third thing, I think, the second thing around that point is about the safeguarding and well-being of children. I think we may quite well see a slight hike in safeguarding issues, which might come to surface when children start coming into school. And we've got to be ready for that. They will have trauma, and family members, friends may have been lost. So schools will need to help address that aspect. And I think the next thing is about how leaders are going to be thinking about and managing their own capacity within an already tight, what was already a very tight and limited budget and resource backdrop, and managing all these new changes. I think those are the key things that will need to be thought about.
Devinder, that's brilliant. Thank you. And we'll come back to you a little bit later on in this session. I'm really, really very grateful.
Yeah.
So if it's okay, what I'd like to do is to keep things moving and hand on over now to Clive, who is going to look a little bit at some of the specifics in terms of the nuts and bolts of the curriculum. We know Clive's work is exceptional in terms of its quality and detail, and always served us really, really well in our Methodist schools. So what I'd really like to do is to hand on now to Clive for him to give us some thoughts from the work that he's done on preparing schools and supporting schools with the context of their curriculum and the next steps that we find ourselves needing to take. So over to you, Clive. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to join you, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And what I'd like to do in the first part, if I may, is just look at some general issues that we need to consider as we actually think about children returning to our schools. So the first part, basically, is the more sort of general sort of issues that I'm sure many of you will have already thought of, but actually trying to think of actually creating an action plan, perhaps, around some of these areas. So first of all, I am actually picking up on just a little bit in each of these. There's a much more to go around them, but bear with me while I just try and give you a flavour, basically, of the things that I think we need to think of very carefully. So I've broken these down in this area. First of all, issues related to staff well-being. I think school leaders need to be aware, and that includes governors, of course, that staff may well have actually had a chance to just almost readdress where they are. They've actually seen a difficult period where they've been frightened for their own family. You may well have some staff who are coming back basically saying, look, that extra responsibility I've got for X, Y, or Z, I would like to relinquish that because I do need to spend more time with my family. That could be one thing that we could just see happening in quite a few schools. The other thing I think that's going to be important are re-establishing sort of routines and expectations within schools. We will have children who may well find separation from their families being quite an anxious part of what they're going to go through. I have two grandchildren. Funnily enough, the 14-year-old is very, very anxious about returning to school. My 9-year-old granddaughter can't wait to see her friends. So there's going to be a huge difference between the way children respond to what they've actually seen so far. The other thing is that obviously there were children from the vulnerable families who've been at school for all of this time, and of course others have not. Some of those children who've been there may have feel they've lost out on something, or indeed those who've been home learning might have felt they've lost out on something. And actually being aware that there may be some sort of issues around that area. Devinder quite naturally mentioned safeguarding. The other thing about the thing that I'm raising here is to be aware that we all know that unfortunately the evidence is conclusive. There's been a very big sort of upsurge in the number of domestic abuses on just one area. And that might actually find ourselves in positions where we have more and more disclosures from children. And the information I'm receiving from preparedness for that, the disclosures may well not be coming from some children for a few months, let alone an immediate disclosure. The other big problem, which I think is one that we're all facing, are things like the new reception intake, especially if we do not return until September. There are many schools. I'm fortunate enough to be the sponsor of 15 primary schools under a multi-academy trust. We've already done things like videoing the early years area and specifically looking and getting parents hopefully to share with those new children, this is the sand area, this is what you do in this area, this is where you will actually hang your coat. Getting things like that being already done using the technologies available to really help in that regard. We've also got the issue by year 6 leavers. Some of them may feel a little bit hard done by, I'm sure, if they haven't had a proper farewell from their school. There are schools even talking about working with their secondary schools to actually have the children back in the primary setting for 2 weeks in September, if indeed September was a return time, or having a specific couple of days somewhere early on where the students go back to their primary schools to really ensure they've been actually given a fond farewell from the primary setting. Children with special educational needs, particularly those from an autistic background who are used to routines, and as we all know, routines are a massive part of their everyday life. Those are just some of the things I want to touch on in a more generic sort of way. But the main thing I want to do with you this afternoon is to pick up on the curriculums, if I may. And I'm going to start off by obviously picking up on reading. I think we all clearly are aware that there are some children, we've actually almost got to a certain stage in reading before the lockdown, where we were really knowing that where they were might have been quite fragile, and they needed daily support from teachers at that level. Of course, at home, some children would have excellent care with parents reading to them regularly, listening to them read regularly, but unfortunately, as the time has gone on, with children being at home, and particularly if children are not back until September, be aware that some of that enthusiasm from parents may have waned a little bit in the last few weeks before children's return to school. So that's a big issue. Those Key Stage 1 children, particularly in different phonics groups, we may well find, unfortunately, they may not be at the same level as they were beforehand. Basically, schools have made a brilliant attempt to get messages to parents about reading and reading at home. But actually, sometimes the activities the parents have gone for are the kind of the more practical, crafty type examples and experiences that they're offering to their parents. So some of the issues for me around reading will be the phonics groups, for instance. Trying to make sure that we are actually getting children back at the right level. English leaders or reading leaders in school will need to provide bridging activities for younger children, helping staff to really have good quality examples available, particularly newly qualified teachers and teachers perhaps new to a school. Basically, it might mean that for a short period of time, we may have to have extra phonics session being brought into school to really get children back up to where they were before we actually close down. For older children, we need perhaps to introduce perhaps extra quiet reading times to really get them up to speed with reading independently. There's a recent research out, for instance, that says that children from 10 to 15, if they are not reading fiction regularly, they are likely to have a problem with their reading ages. Now, many children at that level, at 10 and 11-year-olds, are year 5 and 6 years into years 7 and 8, may well be independent of what they've been doing during the lockdown. Perhaps for many of them, that may not have included reading fiction as often as they should have done. So that could be a big aspect there that we might need to look at. Basically, also, I think to help with reading, we need to be, I believe, much more conscious of the fact for teachers to read to their class more regularly, perhaps a little bit more than we were doing before, to really get children back into books, excited about reading, and back into the rhythm of things. And basically also to try and ensure that children are engaged in reading research, for part of their research, reading being a big requirement within that area. So for me, reading, I think, will be the biggest thing. So what can we be doing now? Let's talk to our English leaders. Let's talk to our reading leaders. What can we already know? What can we already anticipate that we may have to have ready? Those bridging activities and making some timetable adjustments for more independent reading. I put a little action plan together for you in the handout. I'm not going to go through that, but that summarizes what I've just put together there. On the core subject areas, the big issue I think we face is that mathematics and science are presented in the national curriculum on a year-by-year basis. So a child, for instance, may well have missed out, perhaps a year 3 child might well have missed out on the fractions unit of work from year 3, and suddenly they're in year 4, and there's a big gap. So I think the maths leaders in schools need to look at what elements have been missed in the mathematics curriculum and how they can help children get up to speed with that by perhaps looking at that fractions example. Is there a way of combining the year 3-4 fraction unit to really enable our children not to have missed out on something before? Similarly with science, where again, the science curriculum is presented to us on a year-by-year basis. So if we've missed out on what is the best part of half a year's worth of learning, they may have missed out on the plants unit in year 2, and then we need to find ways of linking that with the plants unit from the following year. The English curriculum, I've mentioned the reading already, but the English curriculum is at least presented in the national curriculum on a 2-year basis. And I think there may be some sort of flexibility within that to enable us to catch up a little bit more quickly. Within that realm, basically, what we've got to look at then is how we can actually do that. What has been missed, particularly from the grammar side and the vocabulary side of the curriculum. So basically, my view of the core curriculum is that the maths leaders in our school need to look at where there have been missed elements from this closure and how they can actually link that with next year's work if the return isn't until September. Similarly, for science leaders, they need to look at what did happen, what was covered and what wasn't covered in each of those year groups, and support staff to be able to really link science with the other classes. I mentioned the plants work from year 2, perhaps being combined with the plants work in year 3 and delivered in year 3 because of what they've missed out. Similarly, with the English leaders, carrying out a survey basically, consider whether there are likely to be gaps. The other area, of course, and Devinder mentioned a lot of this, was the non-core. Sorry, before I go to that, again, there's an action plan I put together, which you may find useful just to have a look at and address some of those issues. Devinder mentioned particularly the design of the curriculum across the school. I've been very, very, very much engaged in curriculum development since the new national curriculum came in 2014, and of course the revamping basically the schools have had to do since the framework really put this additional emphasis on the curriculum as a whole. I think this is a great opportunity basically for schools. The one thing that perhaps comes out of this is a chance for school to really say, or senior leaders in school, to really have a look at where they've got to so far, and to really be able to ask themselves some deep questions about what have they got right or they haven't got right just yet. From my experience of working with schools, the coverage basically has been sorted. People know, well, we're going to do the Romans in year 4 or whatever. What I think many schools have missed are the concepts within the history and the geography national curriculum particularly. And this, I think, is a chance for us to readdress some of that. So I've actually put together here some of the issues that I'm really trying to work with schools. I'm not saying it's going to be right for you, but accept it perhaps as somebody really looking at trying to put something together for you. For instance, okay, in the history of geography, do we do enough work on things like causation in history, cause and effect? Do we do enough work on key skills and map work in geography? And what I'm trying to do here is to aim at looking at what we could be doing much, much more effectively. So, for instance, in the history curriculum, I've just put an example here, for instance. First of all, breaking the units of work, say the Romans or whatever, into 3 clear elements. For me, one of them would definitely be focus on relevance, location, timelines, and general overview. So, for instance, if I was actually doing that unit of work on the Great Fire of London in Key Stage 1, to bring a relevance in, perhaps my starting point might be with the Grenfell Tower, to really recognize, although unfortunately there was a huge amount of loss of life, the way it was dealt with, the fire was out almost immediately, overnight virtually, as against the Great Fire of London, which carried on for days, and get children then to be aware that the reason for that was that they didn't have the firefighting implements they have today at that period of time. So basically, the elements for me might well be, for each of my history units, something like timelines, location, general overview, followed by that cause and effect, and bringing in some empathy at the same time. The third element might be something like a case study. If I'm actually looking at that unit of work on the Stone Age, the third element may be a real high focus on Skara Brae, the Orkney Islands, and to really get that looked at that level. I've then included some examples of timelines I'm using in Key Stage 1. For instance, I would implore that before we look at timelines with very young children, we start with a timeline which actually corresponds with the length of time they've actually been alive. So perhaps starting from about 2013 to up to 2020, for instance, and adding in there things like obviously when they were born, when a sibling might have been born, when were they christened, when they might have had a cat or a dog or whatever, trying to get them to recognize what a timeline is before they moved on to the more complex one of trying to pinpoint when the Great Fire of London was. So for instance, putting a timeline from when Jesus was born to the current day, being an important component there to really help them. Then I've actually put some examples in of a unit of work, the Great Fire of London one. I'm obviously not going to go through that with you in detail, but I'm just simply putting it in the handout that James will send you, just for you to have a look at the way that I'm recommending that we're looking at. The first part here is all about the learnings, all about that long-term memory. It's all about actually making sure that we start with a review of what children already know, and that we end with a reflection of the learning so they can really take it further. And then I've broken the rest down into each of the elements I've talked of in history, starting with those concepts of relevance, location, timeline, moving on to causation and empathy in the second element, and then the third element being the case study that I mentioned a few moments ago. In the geography I then followed that with an art or a DT activity, in this case an art activity, which hopefully you can see where I'm heading for. On the geography side, the first element for me would definitely be about the use of maps, the location, making sure that children are aware basically of the names of the countries, the names of the places we're in. The second element for me would be very much on a human and physical feature, and then bringing that back to a local context, perhaps, under the third element of my The other thing on the geography is making decisions. This is a map of the world that I would use with all my Key Stage 1 children. However, this is the map of the world I would use my Key Stage 2 children. And I hope you can see the difference and the need for that difference. Similarly, looking at a map of the UK that I would use with Key Stage 1 and a map of the UK that I'd always be using with Key Stage 2. Then basically what I've tried to do is put a rainforest example, again in Key Stage 2 in this case, to give you those sort of examples of how to develop those sort of elements that I actually talked about. So what am I actually saying here in a nutshell, effectively? I think from the curriculum design side, this is a great opportunity. This is where our subject leaders have got that little bit of space that they've craved for to really get to grips with getting some of these concepts into the curriculum as a whole. And I'm only going from the point of view of having been able to work with, must be hundreds of schools now. If there's a weakness, more so than any other, the weakness very often is not having gone back into the national curriculum and read about the concepts that their curriculum is trying to develop with younger children. So I hope that's helpful to you. I hope that you can see why I've tried to put together what I put together this afternoon for you. I hope the exemplars I put in may well actually help you with further understanding of what I'm trying to get across. Thanks very much, James. Back to you.
Thank you, Clive, very much. I realised that there were some sound difficulties there, and one or two people through the chat were saying that they couldn't hear. So what I'll do, if that's okay, is just briefly recover, and Clive can nod if I'm getting this right, because I certainly wouldn't dream of putting words in his mouth. But I think some of the key information that that Clive was giving us there are that, and I ought to also say that, of course, Clive has very kindly said that all of his slides will be available. And when we finish recording this piece, we will add some sound captions to it too, so that there's more clarity around what Clive is saying. But I think key elements that he's been identifying this afternoon have been that maths and science leaders are specifically going to need to think carefully about what pieces of learning may well have been missed that should be being built on in the years to come, because the maths and science curriculum are built on an annual basis. There's a little bit more capacity for English leaders because the curriculum is loosely developed over a 2-year sort of a cycle. So that's a little bit more flexible, but still I think it's key for those leaders to be thinking about where they need to recover some lost bits of learning in order to be able to build. And then I also got a real sense of optimism from what Clive was saying about an opportunity for our subject leaders to really get to think about what the key bits of knowledge and learning concepts are in each of their specific subjects, and look at how we may well prioritize the teaching and learning of those key concepts, breaking them down into learning types perhaps, or to sort of event-based types. And he used the examples of a history timeline and looking at empathy and the key events that have occurred in the course of history, and how we might group some of that learning together and help that to be able to be something that is developable over time. And really, I think to finish what Clive was trying to share was that there is a great opportunity here to really get to grips with what it is that our children need and where we need to be taking them, on the basis of having some specific opportunity to do a bit of detailed work that perhaps we might not normally be able to do. Clive, does that seem to kind of summarise what you were saying in brief terms?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, James. That's really very much trying to put exactly what I was trying to get across. So thanks very much for that.
That's great, thank you. And as I say, please don't worry that if you didn't quite manage to get all of the wisdom that Clive was giving, we will make sure that A, you get all of the slides, but B, also that we'll add some captions through the process of recording so that people can hear that sort of straight from the horse's mouth, as it were, without being rude. Thank you, Clive. But certainly that's where we'll go to next. So we have 1 or 2 questions that have come through, and we have got some questions to be able to ask. What I shall do is I'll begin by asking Devinder a couple of questions, if that's okay, and then perhaps if we then come to Clive to recover 1 or 2 other key bits of information that we think could be significant. And again, if there's a necessity to, what I shall do is strain my ears as clearly as I can to be able to relay some of that information back again. So Devinder, if it's okay, what I'll do is come to you first, if that's all right, and ask you one of the questions that we feel that we've been sent in. And I think this is kind of key for all of us that are in terms of involved in leading schools. So we know that the quality of education judgment is somewhat superseding the data recorded measures. So what do you think, in a nutshell, it needs to be that we should be thinking in schools that must be put right or done differently in pupil performance terms? I realise that you talked a little bit about being able to think a little bit more sort of dynamically about the way in which work is presented, but can you give us a kind of a nutshell of the sorts of things that we might be able to focus on, given that we know that data alone is not necessarily giving us a full picture? And of course, as we've said, sometimes we've heard that schools that have got really strong data are being classified as RI or below that judgment. So what can we, in a nutshell, be focusing on specifically in terms of pupil performance?
I think the most important thing, James, it goes back to the 2 things: what is learning and what is progress. I think that is sometimes confused, even with schools that I've worked with more recently. Progress is seen as data or internal tracking and that sort of thing, and schools have been sometimes shocked that I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at really how much of the curriculum do children recall, can articulate, and can apply in a connected way to other concepts. So, for example, in, you know, just looking at the planets in science. You know, why is there, why is it so cold? Why is there ice on the furthest planet from the sun? Can they link that to the water cycle? Can they link that to how the sun on the earth allows plants to grow and that sort of thing? And I found that the children can't make those wider, broader connections. So here, I think it's about factoring in time to get children to think and connect, think and link, as I say, what they know with what potential, the different aspects of what they know. I think that's one thing. The second thing, it goes back to knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. You know, how do you measure that? I think that's really, really important. And let me break that down a little bit further. So, for example, when we talk about children, sort of, sorry, just my train of thought has gone there. In discussion and debate, what does the discussion and debate look like in year 1, and what does it look like in year 6? That's a question. Number 2, if children in reception classes are using nails and hammers to create a windmill, then what should that look like by the time children reach year 6? Because, you know, in my experience, I have seen children using nails and hammers and saws in reception classes, creating windmills, and I've taken that to the year 6 teachers and saying, well, why are they still using paper and glue? How should this have been developed systematically? And what that pertains to is the lack of clarity about progression. And I think there's real scope to think about this whole business of sequence and the components and the composites, which I don't think enough work has been done on. So I don't know if that's, and it goes back to this business about what Clive said, adapting the curriculum. I think here's an opportunity for us to do that. James, I don't know if I've answered.
Clive, and I think, sorry, thank you, Devinder. And I think what I would also ask you there then is, how might we then particularly think our traditional procedures and processes may well not be linked to really getting to grips with the sequencing that you've talked about? You gave a great example of windmills and how we might be doing technology because of what we think we should cover in year 6, but actually looking back at what children in year reception have been able to do, we've not necessarily sequenced that to be able to do that. And you also talked a little bit earlier on about that top level conversation and making sure that all leaders are at the same place. So can you, in about 1 minute, give us an idea about what key differences the traditional procedures that we might have in school for curriculum design, or that we might have for monitoring and evaluation, how might they be adapted to help us to be able to get into under the skin of this concept of the difference between really good quality substantial learning and just making progress through sequence, or just keeping some learning going? Are there any sort of key bits that you can give us, we can sort of take away?
Yeah, I'll pose one quick question just to be succinct about that. So in science, by the time children reach year 6, we only have expected standards that they reach. Yet in mathematics and in English, we have higher standards or greater depth. What happens to those children who are very, very able in science? You know, how do they show their mastery? How do they show their depth of learning? But that then sits with, you know, history, geography, art, and all the other subjects, how do they show greater depth and mastery, which goes beyond the expected standards? Because there are children who are very able, they in all subjects. So, that, for me, those are lost opportunities that schools, in my opinion, don't always think clearly about. What does mastery look like in geography in year 1? By the end of the year, what should those children be able to say and do?
And I guess to take that a step further, that would be, so if we can get them to that stage at the end of year 1 in terms of mastery, what might that be built on by the time they get to year 2?
Exactly.
Sort of that a heightened sense of expectation. So,
and this is, sorry, James, and this is where I was, earlier I mentioned about leaders having real ambition and that high expectation, thinking outside the box, not being confined by the national curriculum, but using that as a basis to structure the sequence and progression, because it is a great document to as a starting point, but it's only the starting point. And I think it's through no fault of our leaders in schools, because there are restrictions of time and resources. But here is an opportunity to really think so much broadly about curriculum and innovation and design.
Thank you. I think that's really, really clear. Thank you, Devinder. There's some real food for thought there, and I think there's a level of context around autonomy that we've got as a key message, and also a point about making sure that our expectations are not constrained, but that we build them. I wonder if I've got a question that I wonder if I can just pop over to Clive for, really. And I'm conscious that in our group we have some governors that have joined us, and I appreciate that this might not be so easy to hear, but I'd really like to ask this question of you, Clive, if that's okay. We've often, for governors, a straightforward way of analysing performance has been the understanding of what the data is telling us and how that performance happens. And it's easy to do that remotely. It's easier to look at a set of figures and numbers and ask some sort of key questions. But of course, we recognise that the quality of education judgment asks much more of us to understand about that. So how do you think governors can continue to support schools, and how might they differently need to understand what their role will be in monitoring school performance? I don't know, Clive, if you've got any offers that you can give us in terms of what you might see through the curriculum for governors to be able to see and how that might work.
Thanks, James. Yes, immediately for me, it's actually the governor's knowledge of the curriculum has to be really first class. They really do need to really pester, if you like, leaders so they have a really good understanding of the curriculum intent for their school. Particularly where governors come in is the challenge around what is that cultural capital that is mentioned in the inspection framework. They should really be supporting the schools. Many of them may well live in the locality. Many of them will have a better understanding, perhaps, of the cultural capital of the children than perhaps the staff might have initially. Have they had an opportunity to really input that aspect of the curriculum? And also the local aspect. The curriculum in each school should be bespoke to that school. And therefore, has the governor really got a true understanding? How is it bespoke? How is this curriculum really suitable to our children that may not in the least be suitable to a school that's about 3 or 4 miles away? And being able to challenge at that level, I think, would be really helpful. But every time I've worked with governors, and I've had the opportunity of doing a lot of work with governors, I say that their response to understanding more about the curriculum is quite exciting. There are governors, obviously, who enjoy the data stuff, but there will be lots of governors who didn't enjoy that area. But what we are finding is that we can really, really get governors excited about the curriculum if we actually put it across in that sort of way. And I also want one thing aligned to that, Jen, is undoubtedly for me, the knowledge the school leaders have of that curriculum. I find it quite difficult sometimes when I go into a school and I'm being directed to somebody who's not the head of the school when they call them the curriculum leaders. At the end of the day, for me, the head is the curriculum leader, because this is what this framework's about. The head has to know that curriculum inside out. They have to be able to challenge subject leaders around those areas. And one of the areas I think governors might find really, really helpful is not so much the coverage in the national curriculum, but the part which talks about the aims of each of the subjects. And that, to me, is where we need to go back to really understand what geography stands for, what history stands for. Get those sections read really well. Let governors see them. They will then pick up on this cause and effect. They will then pick up on understanding their locality, the key skills in geography, etc. So for me, it's all down to how the school leaders are able to engage and involve the governors in their understanding of the bespoke curriculum that they have for their school.
Thank you, Clive. Ironically, I think your sound is coming back a bit there, which was really helpful. Thank you. So just to very quickly recover, I think that what Clive was talking about there was about ensuring that governors understand the intent behind the curriculum at a local level. Why is the curriculum for that school different, and what are the key aspects that it needs to have? And do governors understand what is referenced in the framework as cultural capital? Does everybody understand why the curriculum has been designed in the way that it is and what needs it's meeting in that sense? And I have one final question, Clive, and we are very short of time now. So if we could do in about 1 minute, this is again a put on the spot kind of a question. So if I was a geography subject leader, Clive, and I've got probably 3 weeks before I know that we've got to really start immersing ourselves in some great, really complicated things, what can I do now? What can I be doing now? What 3 or 4 key things can I be doing now that will help to get me in a place where I feel confident that I've got ahead of the curve a little bit rather than I'm trying to catch up?
Just very briefly on the geography side is to go back into the national curriculum and recognise there are 4 major strands. And the 4 strands basically are locational knowledge, place knowledge, human and physical geography, and finally key skills. Get the geography leaders to look at the curriculum that's being presented to children at this moment in time and follow the strands through from reception right through to the end of year 6 and ask, is there a clarity about what Devinder talked about, that progression of learning coming through in each of the strands, not as geography as a whole, but in each of the strands of geography. And the similar situation for every other subject, I would suggest. History particularly has those strands, science has those strands, art has the strands. Try and get them to follow the strands through and make sure the school is strong enough in each of the strands.
Thank you, Clive. We promised that we would keep the session to an hour, and we're bang on 3 o'clock there, everybody. So I'm keen to bring that to a close. There are a couple of things that I want to say. Firstly, just to recover what Clive has said, which is the key thing is to focus on the strands. For our subject leaders to get stuck into what our curriculum planning document focuses on in terms of the strands, and to make sure that we can sequence some clarity of progression from reception up to year 6. Can I say a huge thank you, please, to Clive and to Devinder for sticking with us and for sharing all of the work that they've done in preparation for this and being prepared to talk through their thoughts and ideas, and also to share everything that they've given to us. I think we're really grateful to you for that. Can I say a huge thank you also to everybody that's joined us and that's listened and offered questions as well. I'm really, really grateful to you for being here and for supporting us that way. And can I also let you know, please, that we're very much hopeful that we would like to be able to put another thinking about next week, and we'll send out some further details that gives you some more information about that as time goes on. Again, sincere apologies for the sound quality of some aspects of that, but I know that you've got a key sense of some of the really important messages there, and we'll make sure that we recover as much of that as we possibly can. Barbara, before we finish and close off, can I hand it back to you for the final word? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, James. I'd just like to thank people very much for bearing with us when some aspects of the sound have not been perfect. We did say this is our first attempt at this, and I'm delighted by the number of you who've been with us. And I'm also really delighted by the quality of the contribution that we've had from Devinder and from Clive. Really, really top quality stuff. And next week, we are hoping that we will have with us Barry Carpenter, who has a background both in headship and in education leadership at the DFE, and also as a professor of education. His specialist strengths are to do with psychology, both of children and of adults, and about the impact of this lockdown period and of going back fully into school on children and the grown-ups within our school communities. And he's going to inform our thinking about that so that we can match that with our learning about the restructuring of the curriculum and with all those practical questions about how we keep the desks clean. So next week, a big focus on recovery and working with a really high quality specialist. And we will, I promise you, make sure that the sound is tip top. Thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye, everybody.